The arrival. Commander Krax paced relentlessly across his office aboard Space Station Atlas 7, his multiple sets of arms twitching in agitation. The walls, cold and metallic, seemed to amplify the frustration growing within him. His secondary eyes flicked constantly to the stack of transfer orders on his desk, each bearing the official seal of the Galactic Defense Force. The orders were a cruel joke, and Krax could feel the weight of each page mocking him. "This can't be real," he muttered to himself. "It just can't." It was the year 3457, and Krax, a seasoned combat instructor at the Centor Military Academy, had just been informed that the human race would be integrated into the galaxy's military operations. He had spent decades training the finest warriors from the most advanced species across 12 galaxies, and now he was expected to welcome humans into this prestigious institution. The sheer absurdity of it all infuriated him. The human species, to put it mildly, was underwhelming. No exoskeletons. No extra limbs for strength or combat. Their bones were fragile, made of mere calcium, not reinforced with alloys or metals like almost every other species in the galaxy. Even the weakest of galactic species had some form of augmentation or enhancement. But humans? They were fragile, unrefined, and physically underprepared for any serious combat. When Krax had first seen the orders, he thought it was a practical joke. Perhaps one of his old academy friends, Admiral KNX, was playing a prank on him. But as the days passed, the reality set in. This was no joke. The High Command had, in all their infinite wisdom, decided that humans would join forces with the galaxy's finest warriors. Krax let out a low growl, his frustration escalating. "Humans, of all species," he murmured. "This is beyond anything I've ever heard." He paused by the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of space. The Centor Military Academy had been producing the galaxy's finest soldiers for over 10,000 years. Its graduates had commanded ships capable of obliterating planets, and its combat specialists had brought wars to an end before they even started. This was the pinnacle of military excellence, and now it was being sullied by the inclusion of humans. "Let me tell you something about humans," Krax growled, turning away from the view. "They are utterly ridiculous. They don't even have the common sense to use proper equipment. And now, they expect us to train them. It's a nightmare." His mood worsened when Cadet PX, his assistant, entered the room. PX, a tall, armored being with glowing scales, was a seasoned combat specialist and trusted advisor to Krax. "Commander Krax, the human transport has cleared final decontamination," PX reported, his voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. Krax's antennae twitched. "Wonderful," he said sarcastically. "I suppose they remembered their gravity compensators, didn't they? Or should we reduce our standard 3G environment to accommodate their fragile bodies?" PX shifted uneasily. "Actually, sir, they declined the gravity compensation. They insisted on handling the standard environment." Krax froze. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous. "They declined? Even the Carrick use gravity compensators. These humans are either naive or foolish." PX shuffled his feet, uncomfortable under Krax's glare. "Yes, sir. They chose not to use them. They wanted to prove they could handle the gravity." Krax couldn't believe what he was hearing. "They want to die early, I suppose." He shook his head, muttering angrily under his breath. The transport's arrival was imminent, and Krax had no choice but to prepare for the human recruits. He could already feel a headache forming. His office felt smaller as the pressure mounted. The transport docked, a small, sleek vessel that seemed laughable compared to the massive troop carriers used by the Galactic Defense Forces. Cost-effective, they called it. The humans had adapted one of their civilian ships for military use, and Krax found it difficult to suppress his laughter. This, he thought, was what the High Command thought would integrate humanity into the military elite. As PX gathered the current class of cadets, the Andorians, Nexar, Bronx warriors, Krax walked toward the docking bay, his mind racing with disbelief. This was supposed to be a training facility for the best of the best, and now they were adding humans into the mix. Let them see what the High Command has saddled us with, Krax muttered to himself. With each step, his heart sank further. This wasn't going to end well. First impressions. The airlock doors slid open with a satisfying hiss, and Commander Krax's eyes scanned the assembled cadets as they stood at attention, their various species and anatomies aligned with perfect military precision. The tall, proud Andorians stood strong, their silicon-based muscles gleaming under the harsh light. The Nexar twins, their neural processing speed so advanced that they could perceive things at the speed of thought, stood in perfect synchronization. Even the Bronx warriors, known for their gravitational manipulation fields, hummed with latent power, their presence commanding respect. Krax stood at the head of the group, preparing to address them. His eyes darted nervously to the airlock as the transport carrying the human recruits finally arrived. He knew the moment would be historic, the first humans to join the ranks of the Centor Military Academy, but he had no idea how unprepared he was for what he was about to witness. The moment the humans stepped into the bay, an eerie silence fell over the cadets. Krax had seen many recruits come through these doors, but never one like this. The human, Marcus Bennett, stood there alone, without any visible life support or gravity-compensating equipment. He didn't appear to be struggling with the pressure of the station's 3G environment, and yet, in Krax's eyes, he seemed small and fragile. The others were staring, their eyes wide with disbelief. Krax noticed Cadet Rexus, an Andorian warrior, adjust his visual enhancement feed, probably trying to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The human recruit stood at attention, showing no signs of discomfort, no expression of fear, just a quiet confidence that Krax couldn't quite place. He had expected a frail, trembling figure, but instead, he found a recruit whose posture suggested determination, or, more troubling, perhaps, arrogance. The entire room was silent. It felt as though a great weight had fallen on the academy, and for a brief moment, Krax could almost feel the tension in the air. He cleared his throat, pushing aside the nagging sense of unease that crept up on him. State your name and prior military affiliation for the record, Krax ordered, though his voice was sharp with disbelief. Marcus Bennett, sir. United Earth Defense Force, 7th Orbital Division, the human replied, his voice clear, unwavering, and oddly commanding. It carried across the bay without any sign of strain, despite the intense gravity pressing down on him. Krax looked him up and down, his trained eyes scanning the recruit's body for any signs of weakness. Height. Inadequate. Muscle mass. Barely registered. Bone density. Well, at least it was within minimal acceptable ranges for space travel. Krax muttered under his breath, assessing the human from every angle. So you're the one they've sent us? Yes, sir, Marcus replied. There was no hesitation in his voice, no fear. In fact, his calmness only seemed to annoy Krax even more. Krax's secondary arms twitched, and he felt a headache forming in the back of his mind. His sharp, triangular features twisted into a frown. Tell me, Bennett, Krax said, trying to hide the skepticism that bled into his words. Did your superiors explain the physical requirements of our program? Yes, sir. Full briefing received and acknowledged, Marcus answered, his face betraying no hint of doubt. Behind Marcus, Krax noticed the Andorian cadet, Rexus, covering his primary breathing pore in what was unmistakably an attempt to suppress a snicker. Several other cadets around the room, including the Bronx warriors, were displaying similar signs of amusement. They couldn't seem to fathom what kind of human would willingly submit themselves to the brutal training regimen of the Centor Academy. It was evident that they had already written Marcus off as an unlikely candidate for success. At ease, Krax ordered, his voice cool, but his curiosity piqued. Marcus shifted his stance smoothly, adjusting to the weight of the gravity, and the medical monitors embedded in the floor quietly recorded his steady vital signs. Despite the heavy pressure, his heart rate remained normal for a human, which, in Crax's mind, only added to the mystery of this peculiar recruit. Cadet Rexus, his crystalline muscles gleaming in the harsh lighting, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should give our new friend a demonstration of our standard training protocols," Rexus suggested, his voice tinged with a challenge. Crax could tell that Rexus had already decided to test Marcus, perhaps in an attempt to show the human just how out of place he truly was. It was a typical move for new recruits to assert their dominance over each other in the first moments of training, and Crax had seen it countless times before. But there was something about Rexus's tone that intrigued him, something that made him curious to see just how far this human could push himself. "Proceed, Cadet Rexus," Crax ordered. Rexus's movements were a blur of elegance and raw power. His Andorian muscle structure propelled him through an intricate series of combat stances, each position generating enough force to shatter reinforced armor. As Rexus accelerated, his limbs moved faster than human eyes could track, and the air seemed to hum with the force of his strikes. The display was mesmerizing, an almost perfect display of control and strength. Marcus Bennett stood still, watching quietly. His expression remained unchanged as Rexus finished the sequence, his muscles still humming with latent power. The Andorian cadet turned to face Marcus, awaiting a response. "Impressive display, sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. The energy conservation in the third sequence was particularly noteworthy. Rexus blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the comment. Marcus had noticed something about his technique that no one else had before, and worse, he had understood it. The rest of the cadets in the room exchanged confused glances, their faces displaying a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some of the cadets in the back row, the Nexar twins, began exchanging neural signals rapidly, their confusion evident in their fluctuating aura patterns. Cadet Czar, her tentacles twitching in what appeared to be barely contained mirth, spoke up. "Our human friend would like to demonstrate his own combat capabilities now, wouldn't he?" Crax found himself interested in what Marcus would do next. The human recruit had shown a keen observation of Andorian combat, but what would he be able to do in return? Would he be just another weak recruit, failing to impress? Or was there something about him that was truly different? "Proceed, Bennett," Crax said, his voice almost a whisper, filled with unspoken curiosity. The Academy was about to witness something unlike any demonstration they had seen before. The demonstration. As Marcus Bennett took his first steps into the training arena, the energy in the room shifted. The cadets, previously amused by the human's appearance, began to take note of his movements. Some had already written him off as weak, but now, with his quiet confidence, he was preparing to challenge that assumption. Crax stood back, watching with both skepticism and curiosity. He had seen countless recruits, some of them prodigies, others barely capable of completing basic training, but none had ever approached their first test with the kind of calm that Marcus exhibited. Marcus's stance, however, immediately raised alarm bells in Crax's mind. It was wrong. Everything about it was unorthodox. His feet were misaligned, his body slightly off-center, and his limbs were positioned inefficiently. He was breaking every rule that Crax had spent decades teaching his cadets. But then, something about it caught Crax's attention, something that made his combat instructor's intuition twinge with curiosity. The stance felt wrong, but it also felt strangely balanced. It was like a puzzle where all the pieces had been placed upside down, yet they still fit together in some impossible way. "Are you ready?" Crax called, his voice firm, trying to suppress the rising doubt inside him. "Show us what you've got." Marcus didn't answer. He simply nodded and began moving. The human's movements were slower than Rexus's. It was clear that he lacked the advanced speed and power of the Andorian. But there was something else, something that the other cadets didn't anticipate. Marcus's movements were deliberate. He didn't waste energy. Every motion seemed calculated, as if he was waiting for the exact moment to strike. The other cadets, still underestimating him, stood in silence. They expected to see a clumsy, uncoordinated display. They expected him to collapse under the pressure. But that didn't happen. Marcus moved into a series of strikes, each one slow but precise, his posture shifting in ways that Krax hadn't seen before. He didn't rely on raw power like Rexus or the others did. Instead, he was using techniques from Earth martial arts that, although not advanced in terms of speed, were efficient in terms of positioning and leverage. Krax's antennae twitched as he observed the human stance again. It was awkward, yes, but there was a method to it. He was relying on something more than sheer strength. Marcus was using his environment, manipulating his own body in ways that seemed to defy logic. For a moment, Krax couldn't help but wonder if the human understood something that he, as a combat instructor, had missed all these years. But that wasn't what made the display so perplexing. What really caught Krax off guard was how, despite his slower movements, Marcus was holding his own. As the combat progressed, the human was dodging and evading with an uncanny precision. His body flowed with each motion, his feet barely touching the ground as he moved from one position to the next. Each strike he made was more calculated than the last, as though he was learning as he went. "What is this?" Cadet Czar whispered from the back of the room, her tentacles twitching with surprise. She had been watching intently, her eyes narrowed as she processed Marcus's every move. Despite the visible effort it took, Marcus continued to evade the next series of attacks from the cadets. His lack of raw strength was evident, but what he lacked in power, he more than made up for with adaptability and ingenuity. It was unlike anything Krax had seen in years. And then, Marcus made his move. In one swift motion, Marcus shifted his weight and launched himself into a spinning kick. It was slower than Rexus's attack, but it was perfectly timed. His foot connected with the weapon rack on the opposite side of the arena, and with surprising force, he launched a heavy training weapon into the air, just grazing the top of Cadet Rexus's head. The Andorian had to leap back to avoid the impact. The entire room went silent. For a moment, no one spoke. The cadets stared at Marcus in disbelief, their previous amusement fading into a mix of awe and confusion. Even Krax found himself momentarily speechless. The human, who had been expected to fail, had just launched a heavy weapon through the air with incredible accuracy and timing. "Impressive," Marcus said calmly, as though the entire display had been just another practice session for him. His chest rose and fell with a slow, controlled breath, and the medical monitors registered normal vitals, despite the intensity of the challenge. Krax's mind raced. How had this human, who appeared so physically inadequate, managed to perform this well? Was it just a fluke? Or was there something more to Marcus Bennett than anyone had realized? The other cadets were no longer laughing. Rexus, who had been the most vocal in his mockery, now stood in stunned silence, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in thought. The Andorians, who had once thought little of this human, now watched him with a kind of respect that only warriors could understand. "Marcus Bennett," Krax said, his voice unusually calm, considering the chaos of thoughts swirling in his mind. "You've just demonstrated something I did not expect." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "You're not like the other recruits." Marcus nodded, his expression still unchanged. "Thank you, sir." As Krax stood there, observing Marcus and the other cadets, he realized something important. Humanity, despite their physical limitations, had a resilience and adaptability that was unique. Marcus had shown him something that no other species had, the ability to learn and evolve in real time, using techniques and strategies that no one else had ever considered. This human wasn't just surviving the tests, he was thriving. And for the first time, Krax wasn't sure who had the advantage in this training session. "Cadets," Krax finally said, his voice carrying across the room. "Today, you've witnessed something extraordinary. This human has shown us that there's more to strength than just raw power. Perhaps there's something more we can learn from him after all. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We'll see how the rest of the training goes, but remember, never underestimate your opponents. Never. The cadets nodded, their expressions still filled with a mix of awe and respect. As Krax turned and walked toward the exit, his thoughts were heavy with the realization that the future of galactic warfare might not be determined by strength alone. The human recruit had proven that, and the academy would never be the same again. The test of strength. The following day, the academy's training arena was set up with a variety of challenges designed to push the recruits to their physical and mental limits. Krax stood at the edge of the arena, observing the preparations. The challenge today was simple, yet brutal, a series of combat scenarios meant to test a recruit's physical strength, endurance, and their ability to think on their feet. For every recruit, it was a moment to shine, to show what they were truly made of. But for Marcus Bennett, this would be a true test of his limits. Krax's antennae twitched as he watched the cadets line up. They were all seasoned warriors, each with years of experience under their belts. The Andorians, with their silicon-based muscle structures, the Nexar with their high-speed neural processing, and even the Bronx warriors, who had the ability to manipulate gravity fields, all stood ready for the test. Their movements were fluid, confident, they knew they could conquer whatever came their way. Then, there was Marcus. He stood at the back of the line, his posture still steady and confident, but there was an unmistakable air of uncertainty about him. He had already proven himself in the earlier exercises, but now it was time to see if he could handle the full force of Centor Academy's rigorous training. His muscles were underdeveloped compared to the others, his body seemingly frail next to the towering Andorians and powerful Bronx warriors. His physical attributes might have been lacking, but it was his mind, his adaptability, that had kept him standing thus far. Krax couldn't help but wonder if that would be enough to survive the next challenge. Cadets, Krax's voice rang out, commanding the attention of everyone in the arena. Today's challenge is simple. You will each face a series of obstacles designed to test your strength, endurance, and your ability to think under pressure. Your success will depend not only on your physical abilities but on your resourcefulness. He turned to the recruits. The final test will be lifting and moving a heavy artillery piece. The cadet who completes the task fastest and most efficiently will have their name etched into the Academy's record. The final challenge, a massive piece of training artillery, was placed at the center of the arena. It was a colossal weapon designed to test the physical limits of any soldier. It required the combined strength of several cadets just to move it into position, and it was a task that none had ever completed alone. The cadets looked at it with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Prepare yourselves, Krax continued. You will face this challenge individually, and you will be timed. The first cadet, Rexus, stepped forward. His crystalline muscles gleamed under the harsh lights, and he moved with a fluidity that spoke of both grace and raw power. His hands wrapped around the artillery piece, and with a grunt of effort, he began to lift. The weapon groaned under his touch, but Rexus's strength was more than enough to push it into motion. Slowly but surely, he began to drag the piece across the arena, his every movement measured, controlled. Within moments, the weapon was placed exactly where it needed to be. The other cadets clapped in admiration, impressed by Rexus's speed and power. He had set the bar high, but it was expected of him. Andorian warriors were known for their raw physical strength. For them, this was almost child's play. Next came the Bronx warriors, two towering figures who manipulated the gravity around them to make even the heaviest loads feel weightless. They approached the artillery piece with a confidence that only those who could manipulate the very fabric of space could possess. With their powerful gravitational fields, they shifted the massive weapon with ease, making it look effortless. Within seconds, the piece was in place. As the other cadets performed their feats of strength, Krax couldn't help but glance at Marcus Bennett. He had already demonstrated an impressive amount of resilience and adaptability, but this challenge would be something else entirely. The weapon in question was unlike anything Marcus had encountered before. There was no way he could rely on sheer strength alone. And yet, Krax felt a strange sense of anticipation. Would this human somehow defy the odds once again? Finally, Marcus stepped forward. His face remained calm and determined, though Krax noticed a faint glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes. Unlike the Andorians, Nexar, and Bronx warriors, Marcus had no enhanced musculature, no gravitational powers. He didn't have the physical advantages that the other cadets possessed. But what he did have was a keen mind, and a remarkable ability to find solutions where others saw only problems. As Marcus approached the artillery piece, the room fell silent. He stared at the weapon, sizing it up. Krax watched him closely, knowing full well that the human had no chance of lifting it the way the others had. The pressure was on, and everyone in the room could feel it. The cadets, once filled with mockery and doubt, now stood quietly, their eyes fixed on Marcus. There was something about him that made them hesitate. Was it courage? Or foolishness? Marcus crouched slightly, placing his hands on the weapon, but instead of trying to lift it with brute force like the others, he began to study it. Krax furrowed his brow. What was he doing? Was he attempting to reason with the inanimate object? He had no gravity manipulation or enhanced strength. What could he possibly do? Then, something unexpected happened. Marcus didn't try to lift the weapon at all. Instead, he began examining its structure, finding the points where it was most vulnerable. He carefully adjusted his stance, positioning himself not to fight against the weight of the weapon but to leverage it. With a series of calculated movements, he shifted his weight, using the momentum of his body to shift the artillery piece slightly. It wasn't much at first, but with each movement, Marcus made a little more progress. The cadets exchanged confused glances. What was happening? Was he failing? No. It became clear that Marcus wasn't struggling against the weapon, he was working with it. Slowly, with patience and precision, Marcus continued to manipulate the artillery piece. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as if he were dismantling the weapon rather than simply trying to move it. The cadets couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Despite his lack of strength, Marcus was moving the weapon, shifting it inch by inch with a technique that none of them had considered. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Marcus had moved the artillery piece into position, just as the others had. But it had taken him longer. Much longer. Still, there was something about the way he had done it, a quiet, methodical persistence that spoke volumes. Krax watched in silence, his thoughts racing. This human, despite everything, had accomplished the impossible. He hadn't relied on sheer force. He had relied on strategy, on finding the most efficient way to use his body in harmony with the weapon. It wasn't brute strength that had won this challenge, but intelligence and adaptability. As Marcus stood, catching his breath, the cadets slowly began to clap. It was reluctant at first, but as the seconds passed, their applause grew louder, more genuine. Krax, too, stood there in stunned silence. He had underestimated Marcus Bennett, and in doing so, had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Impressive, Bennett, Krax said at last, his voice steady. You've shown us that strength doesn't always come from physical power. Sometimes, it comes from the mind. The cadets nodded in agreement, their respect for Marcus growing by the second. The human had proven something they hadn't expected. He had shown them that there was more to combat than just physical prowess, and in doing so, had earned his place among the galaxy's finest warriors. The revelation. The next few days at the Centor Military Academy were unlike any Krax had ever experienced. Marcus Bennett's unexpected success had left a lasting impression on both the cadets and the instructors. The academy, known for its rigorous training and its history of producing the galaxy's finest warriors, had been shaken to its core by a single human recruit. Krax could no longer dismiss Marcus as an outlier. There was something about him that defied the laws of conventional warfare, something that made him not only worthy of attention but deserving of respect. The word had spread quickly among the cadets, and Marcus was no longer the subject of mockery and amusement. The once dismissive stares from the Andorians, Nexar, and Bronx warriors had been replaced with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. They had watched him in the training arena, saw how he had manipulated the heavy artillery with precision, and witnessed his ability to adapt and learn on the spot. It was something no one had anticipated, least of all Cracks. As the week progressed, Marcus continued to perform at a level that made Cracks question everything he thought he knew about combat training. His physicality was still lacking compared to the other cadets. His muscles were not as developed, his speed not as fast, and his endurance not as high. But in every scenario, in every test, he found a way to compensate. He relied on his mind, on his ability to analyze situations in ways that the more physically gifted cadets simply couldn't. During a particularly grueling obstacle course, Marcus had surprised everyone once again. The course was designed to push recruits to their limits, filled with hurdles, traps, and physical challenges meant to exhaust even the most seasoned warriors. The cadets before Marcus had struggled, some of them failing to complete the course in the allotted time. And yet, Marcus, without hesitation, took a different approach. Where others had charged forward, attempting to brute force their way through obstacles, Marcus used the terrain to his advantage. He scaled walls with fluid movements, avoided traps by using his surroundings to shield himself, and navigated through the most difficult sections by thinking 2 steps ahead. It wasn't strength or speed that helped him, it was strategy and creativity. It was as though Marcus was playing a different game than everyone else, a game where intelligence and adaptability were more valuable than raw power. At the end of the course, Marcus crossed the finish line not first, but impressively ahead of many others, his breath steady and his posture unshaken. The other cadets, exhausted and covered in sweat, stared at him in disbelief. "Impossible," Cadet Rexus muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. "He should have failed. No one does it like that." Cracks, standing at the observation point, crossed his arms, watching with an intense gaze. He had seen many recruits come and go, but never one like this. Marcus Bennett was proving to be a force in his own right, even without the physical advantages that his peers possessed. Cracks had underestimated the human, and now, he was forced to reckon with the undeniable truth: this human was more than just a curiosity. He was a true warrior. Later that evening, Cracks called Marcus to his office, away from the eyes of the other cadets. As the human entered, Cracks's sharp gaze met his. There was no longer any doubt in the commander's mind: Marcus Bennett was no ordinary recruit. "Sit," Cracks ordered, gesturing to a chair across from him. Marcus complied without hesitation, his calm demeanor still as strong as ever. "You've performed better than I expected, Bennett," Cracks began, his voice measured but carrying a hint of respect. "I've seen many recruits come through these halls, and I've trained some of the finest warriors in the galaxy. But you are different." Marcus didn't respond immediately, his eyes meeting Cracks's as if searching for the deeper meaning behind his words. Cracks studied him for a moment before continuing. "Your strength lies not in your physical abilities, but in your mind. You think differently than the others. You adapt, you learn on the spot, and you find solutions where others see none. The other cadets, for all their strength and power, rely on brute force. You, Bennett, rely on something far more dangerous: creativity." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what Cracks was implying. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. "I've watched you closely these past few days. You've shown me that strength is not always about raw power. You've proven that a warrior's true strength is in their ability to adapt, to think quickly, and to use their environment to their advantage. You may not have the same physical advantages as the others, but you have something far more important." Cracks paused, his gaze softening slightly. "You have the potential to be a great warrior, Marcus Bennett. Perhaps even one of the best. The galaxy has underestimated humanity, and you are showing them just how wrong they are." Marcus didn't smile or show any outward sign of pride. Instead, he simply sat there, absorbing the words of the commander. He had known from the start that he wasn't like the others. He had never expected to be the strongest or the fastest. But he had always known that if he could outthink his opponents, if he could find ways to turn the tide in his favor, he could succeed. And it seemed that his instincts were proving to be right. Cracks leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes assessing Marcus one last time. "You've earned my respect, Bennett. And I believe you will earn the respect of the entire academy. The training ahead will be harder than anything you've faced so far. But I think you're ready. I think, you might even surprise us all." Marcus stood, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. "I'll do my best, sir." As he left the office, Cracks couldn't help but think about what he had just witnessed. A human recruit, showing the galaxy's finest warriors that there was more to strength than just physical power. It was a humbling thought, and one that Cracks would carry with him for a long time. The Centor Military Academy had been built to produce the greatest warriors in the galaxy, and it had always been about the strongest, the most powerful. But Marcus Bennett was proving that there was more than one way to be great. He wasn't the strongest recruit by any means, but he was proving to be one of the most adaptable, and in Cracks's mind, that was the true measure of strength. As the days went on, Cracks's respect for the human grew. And with it, his curiosity about the future of humanity within the galactic forces. If one human could show so much promise, then perhaps the human race was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Marcus Bennett had arrived as an unknown, a curiosity. But now, he was a symbol of the untapped potential of humanity. The galaxy was about to learn a valuable lesson: never underestimate a human. Because when they set their mind to it, they could do the impossible. And Marcus Bennett was just the beginning. The test of loyalty. The days at Centor Military Academy were growing increasingly difficult for Marcus Bennett. As the training sessions continued, the challenges grew more intense, and the cadets were put through some of the most grueling tests they had ever faced. The academy, known for producing warriors of the highest caliber, had designed a new set of tasks meant to test not only physical strength but also emotional resilience and loyalty. These tests, Cracks explained, were meant to measure a recruit's commitment to the academy, their ability to follow orders, and their willingness to put the mission before everything else, even their own safety. Marcus had already proven his strength of character through adaptability, intelligence, and resilience. But now, he would face something even more difficult: a test of loyalty. The cadets gathered in the main arena, their uniforms perfectly aligned, each one standing tall in anticipation of what Cracks had in store. There was an air of quiet tension, especially among the newer recruits, who knew that this test would be unlike any other. It wasn't just about following commands, it was about putting everything they had learned into practice and showing that they were willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. Cracks stood before them, his arms crossed and his expression as cold as ever. "Today, we will test your loyalty," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is not a test of strength or speed, but of commitment. Your ability to put aside personal fear, your willingness to follow orders even when your safety is at risk, and your determination to complete the mission, these are what will be judged today." The cadets exchanged nervous glances. This was the part of training that separated the true warriors from the pretenders. Loyalty was a rare and difficult trait to find in any soldier, but it was especially challenging for those like Marcus, who had never been part of the galactic military before. Cracks gestured to the arena's massive simulation chamber. "You will enter the simulation together. You will face a simulated combat situation. In this scenario, you are part of a team sent to capture an enemy warship. However, your ship is damaged, and you will be forced to make difficult choices. You will encounter situations where your own lives are at risk, and you will need to decide whether to save your comrades or complete the mission." The cadets stood in solemn silence, absorbing Cracks's words. They knew this test would not be easy. It would push them to the limits of their endurance, forcing them to make life-or-death decisions. And as for Marcus, the human recruit, Cracks couldn't help but wonder, would he be able to handle the pressure? Could someone so untested in true combat situations make the right call when everything was on the line? The simulation began without warning. The cadets were suddenly thrust into a hostile environment. The hull of a damaged warship, the air thick with smoke and flashing lights. Alarms blared as the ship's systems failed. Cracks watched the display in the observation room, tracking the cadets' movements in real time. He could see them already separating into their respective roles, using their specialized skills to try and stabilize the situation. Marcus, though, wasn't focusing on the immediate chaos. As the others scrambled to assess the damage, he paused. His eyes darted around, calculating, taking in every detail of the environment. The others were rushing into action without thinking, using brute force to try and clear debris. But Marcus wasn't acting out of instinct. He was thinking. He was searching for the solution. Focus. Cracks barked from the observation room, his voice only audible to the recruits through their earpieces. You are soldiers. The mission comes first. Everything else is secondary. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was already ahead of the game. As the others tried to get the ship's engines running again, he quickly scanned the area for more pressing threats. It was a classic scenario, enemy soldiers boarding the ship to seize control. The mission was clear: protect the ship, complete the objective, and ensure that no valuable technology fell into enemy hands. But there was one thing that was starting to bother Marcus. He noticed a small, isolated group of cadets trapped in a corridor that was about to collapse. They were under heavy fire from enemy forces, and it was clear that saving them would require resources that were needed elsewhere. To succeed, the mission needed to proceed. But at what cost? Marcus felt his heart race. He could hear the sound of laser fire growing louder as the enemy closed in. The cadets in danger were his comrades. He knew them. He had trained with them. And yet, the mission could not afford to waste time. The choices were clear: save the lives of his comrades or press on with the mission. It was a decision that had to be made quickly, and it was not one Marcus could take lightly. He thought back to his days in the Earth Defense Force, where he had been trained to think beyond the obvious, to see the bigger picture. Loyalty to the mission was crucial, but loyalty to those you fought with was just as important. As much as he knew the mission had to come first, he also knew that a true warrior didn't leave his comrades behind. With that thought in mind, Marcus made his decision. He rushed toward the trapped cadets, using all his strength and quick thinking to bypass the obstacles that stood in his way. He coordinated the efforts of the others, directing them to provide cover fire while he freed his comrades. Despite the risk, despite the pressure of the mission, Marcus refused to abandon them. He successfully led the group to safety, his tactical mind always working one step ahead. His quick thinking had saved their lives, and while the mission had been delayed, it was still within reach. As the simulation ended and the lights came back on, Cracks watched silently from the observation room. The cadets were exhausted, but alive. The mission had been completed, just not in the way Cracks had expected. When Marcus entered the debriefing room, Cracks was waiting for him. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, softened for a brief moment. You did well, Cracks said simply, his voice low. You saved your comrades, even though it meant delaying the mission. You showed loyalty where others might have abandoned them. Marcus looked at Cracks, his face expressionless. I didn't leave them behind, sir. I couldn't. Cracks nodded slowly. It's easy to make the logical decision when it comes to combat, Bennett. But you've shown that loyalty, true loyalty, is something that must come from within. It's not always the easy choice, but it's always the right one. And that is what makes you a true warrior. Marcus nodded in response. He wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted to do what was right. And in that moment, he understood something important: being a soldier wasn't just about fighting. It was about knowing when to act, when to follow orders, and when to stand by those you fought alongside. Loyalty, above all else, was what made a true warrior. As Marcus left the room, Cracks stood there for a moment longer, deep in thought. He had watched this human recruit grow from a laughingstock to someone who had earned the respect of the entire academy. He had proven that there was more to a soldier than strength or speed. True warriors, Cracks realized, were made of something deeper, a commitment that transcended the mission, a loyalty that defined them. Marcus Bennett wasn't just a recruit anymore. He had earned his place. And he had earned Cracks's respect. The final challenge. The days following the loyalty test were some of the hardest Marcus Bennett had ever faced. The Centor Military Academy's training regimen had a way of breaking recruits down, pushing them to their physical and emotional limits, only to build them up again, stronger and more capable than before. But despite everything Marcus had learned, despite his adaptability and resolve, Cracks was about to put him through one final challenge, a test that would determine once and for all if Marcus truly belonged among the galaxy's elite warriors. The final challenge was simple, or so it seemed. Cracks had spent days preparing for it, ensuring that it would push the recruits in ways that nothing else had. The objective was clear: survive a full-scale combat simulation against a simulated enemy fleet. The catch? The recruits would be placed in command positions, leading their own squads into battle, with real-time decision-making and life-or-death consequences. Every move they made would have an impact on the outcome of the simulation. This was no longer about brute strength or adaptability alone. It was about leadership, strategy, and the ability to handle immense pressure. Marcus stood at the edge of the arena, watching the other cadets preparing for the simulation. They were calm, collected, and ready. For most of them, this was just another exercise. But for Marcus, this was something different. He had made it this far by thinking outside the box, by using his mind rather than relying on sheer strength. But now, as he looked at the simulation equipment and the team of cadets waiting for his orders, Marcus felt the weight of the responsibility settling in. This would be his chance to prove that he was more than just a resourceful recruit. He would have to prove that he was capable of leading others. As the simulation began, Marcus took his place at the command console. The room around him transformed into a simulation of a massive space battlefield, filled with flashing lights and holographic projections of enemy ships. His hands hovered over the control panel, his mind working at full speed as he assessed the situation. This was no longer about his personal survival. Now, his decisions could mean the difference between life and death for the cadets under his command. "All units, listen up," Marcus said, his voice calm and commanding. "We're facing a superior enemy fleet. They'll outnumber us and outgun us, but we have the advantage of mobility. Our best chance is to use hit-and-run tactics, disable their weapons systems, and keep them off balance. Focus on their command ship first, then we'll work on the smaller vessels." The other cadets, despite their doubts about Marcus's abilities in the past, responded immediately. They trusted him. He had earned that trust with every challenge he had faced, every decision he had made. Now, as they moved into position, they could see the calm determination in his eyes. The simulation began, and the battle unfolded before Marcus's eyes. The enemy fleet, an imposing force of warships and fighters, closed in quickly. The cadets in Marcus's squad moved into position, their ships darting in and out of enemy fire, evading attacks while also launching precision strikes. Marcus watched the battle unfold on his console, calculating each move with precision. Every second was a risk. Every decision had to be made quickly, but without hesitation. For the first few minutes, things went as planned. The cadets in Marcus's squad took out a few smaller enemy ships, but the true challenge lay ahead. The enemy's command ship had positioned itself in the center of the fleet, protected by an array of defensive systems. To defeat the enemy, Marcus would have to find a way to disable the command ship without being caught in its crossfire. Marcus leaned forward, scanning the battlefield. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hands shook slightly as he issued orders, but his mind remained clear. This wasn't just about tactics, it was about leadership. He had to guide his squad through this challenge, and the success or failure of the mission rested on his ability to think outside the box. "Switch to evasive maneuvers," Marcus ordered, his voice firm. "We'll make them think we're retreating. When they break formation to pursue us, we'll have a window to strike." The cadets followed his orders without question, moving their ships in a way that made it look like they were pulling back from the enemy. It worked. The enemy fleet, convinced they had gained the upper hand, broke formation and gave chase. It was exactly the opening Marcus needed. "Now, hit them with everything we've got," Marcus commanded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the enemy ships close in. "Target their command ship's engines. Disable their ability to maneuver." The cadets executed the plan with military precision, launching a barrage of firepower at the command ship's engine core. The enemy tried to respond, but Marcus had already anticipated their counterattack. With his squad in perfect coordination, they overwhelmed the command ship's defenses, disabling it just in time to avoid a retaliatory strike. For a moment, it seemed like victory was within reach. But the enemy wasn't done yet. They had one last trick up their sleeves, a final counterattack that could have destroyed Marcus's entire squad in one devastating blow. Cracks had warned the recruits that survival wasn't guaranteed, and as Marcus watched the incoming strike, he knew that this was the moment that would define him as a leader. The enemy's ships fired their final volley, a massive barrage of energy blasts that could tear through even the strongest shields. Marcus didn't hesitate. He made the call that would save his squad. "All units, engage evasive maneuvers. Deploy shields at maximum strength and prepare for impact." The cadets followed his orders to the letter, and as the energy blasts rained down on them, Marcus's squad braced for impact. The shields held, and though the blast caused massive damage, they survived. The enemy's final strike was repelled, and the remaining enemy ships retreated, their command ship disabled. When the simulation ended, the room fell silent. The cadets were breathing heavily, their faces pale from the intensity of the battle. Cracks, standing in the observation room, watched them with a solemn expression. "Mission accomplished," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "We did it." The other cadets, still catching their breath, turned to him, their expressions full of awe and respect. They had seen Marcus lead them to victory, using his ingenuity and his leadership to defeat an enemy that outclassed them in every way. Cracks stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he regarded the human recruit. "Marcus Bennett," Cracks said, his voice resonating with authority. "You have proven yourself today not just as a soldier, but as a leader. You led your squad through one of the most difficult challenges this academy has ever faced, and you did it with calm, precision, and a determination that I have not seen in a long time. You've earned your place among us." The cadets clapped, their respect for Marcus evident in their applause. Cracks, though reserved, nodded slowly. "The academy has trained warriors who can defeat entire fleets with strength and power. But you, Bennett, have shown us that there is another kind of strength, one that comes from the mind, from leadership, and from an unwavering commitment to the mission and to those you fight beside." Marcus stood there, his heart racing, but his mind clear. He had done it. He had proven that humans, despite their physical limitations, could be just as formidable as any other species in the galaxy. And in doing so, he had earned the respect of not only the Academy but of the galaxy's finest warriors. The future of humanity in the galactic military had just been rewritten, and Marcus Bennett had played a part in changing the course of history. The Academy's walls had witnessed countless triumphs and failures, but today, they had witnessed something extraordinary, the birth of a new kind of warrior. And for Marcus, this was only the beginning.